And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce you to our speaker, I.Kozachenko. And it's my pleasure also to welcome you to this latest lecture in our CIUS seminar series. It may well be the last one for the semester. I.Kozachenko is a Stasiuk Post-Doctoral Fellow at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies here at the University of Alberta. This is a fellowship that is allied with our Contemporary Ukraine Studies program, which many of you know about. He completed his master's and his BA in sociology at the VN Karazin Kharkiv National University, Ukraine. He obtained a PhD in sociology from the University of Aberdeen, the United Kingdom. Dr. Kozachenko is currently working on the project The Ukraine Crisis, Contested Identities, Social Media and Transnationalism. That project explores competing social movements and the way in which national belonging is articulated by these movements within online and offline public spaces. And before you can see the title of the topic that he is speaking on this evening, Fighting for the Homeland from Afar, the Ukrainian Diaspora after Euromaidan. Without any further ado,
thank you very much for this kind introduction, Dr. Tsipkov. And good evening, thank you very much for coming today. So, this is very much research in progress, and I'm a bit overwhelmed by data as I take a lot of cases and have really a lot of data I try to structure it. So I really hope that while talking about this quite complicated subject and with our discussion, I can develop my argument further. Also, I was amazed to attend the Shevchenko Scientific Society lecture last week, where Ernest Giedel was given a lecture about the perceptions of on the diaspora communities by Ukrainian diaspora intellectuals. And there were so many topics which are still very important today, and a lot of problems which still require their solution. So we really can see how the second half of the 20th century it still resonates with the problems nowadays. So to begin with, it is necessary to clarify the key concepts of my study. So, diaspora. In his influential work, Diasporas in Modern Societies, Myth of Homeland and Return, William Safran described the following features a diaspora should possess in order to be different from other communities like expatriates, refugees, and so on. So these crucial traits are initial dispersion from homeland to two or more locations, possession of idealized image of the homeland, beliefs that full integration to the host society is not possible, and notably orientation to the homeland and intention to return at some point. But due to the rapid developments in transportation and especially in information and communication technology, we're all nowadays only one click from home. So any community can maintain strong bonds with the homeland and acquire traits that were previously ascribed only to the classic diasporas. In order to overcome limitations of analysis of diaspora as a list of traits, I conceptualize diaspora as a community. So what diaspora community is? In my research, I address the concept of diaspora to three levels or dimensions of the community. Diaspora may be seen as the extension of nation or culture. Here I refer to diaspora as a nation community. Second, modern means of information and communication technology allow creation of online networks, virtual arenas, and new public spheres. Diaspora as such may be seen as a virtual community as well. And finally, diaspora may be seen as an embodied community represented by localized social networks and Gemeinschaft communities. Today I want to draw your attention mainly to the findings concerning the first two dimensions of diaspora community. So what is imagined community? For the most occasions, the term imagined community refers to a nation. One of the most influential manifestations of this approach is the work on imagined communities by Benedict Anderson. He argues that any community larger than primordial village of face-to-face contacts is imagined in nature, as its members will never know each other, everyone in this community, or even hear of them. But in mind of each exists the image of their community. Moreover, Anderson underlines the role of print media, which make the existence of imagined community possible. Another important contributor is Anthony Smith. He underlines that for a nation, it's important to be narrated by writers, poets, intellectuals. So this is crucial for a nation to emerge from what he calls agony. Then Manuel Castells, in his book The Power of Identity, stresses the role of icons of nationalism. These are symbols, narratives, and discourses that shape national community and make it distinct from others. Well, as the role of print media nowadays is largely substituted by the digital media, it is important to underline the role of the internet. Stephen Fox points out that the majority of online communities are imagined, as they consist of people who never meet each other. But these people still can describe the purpose of this community, its goals and traits. Also, Brenda Chan, in her study of Chinese diaspora, comes to the conclusion that the internet normally crystallizes national identity as it represented by simplified narratives and straightforward and direct symbols. Well, there are several clarifications for the usage of the concept nationalism required. Diasporas are often described as nationalist with the adjective implying negative connotation, such as radical ethnic nationalism or ultra-nationalism. For instance, Maria Koinova defines diaspora nationalism as extreme ideas and methods, negation of the rights of others to achieve linguistic, cultural, and political goals. Per Anders Rudling, in his study of Ukrainian diaspora monuments and commemoration practices in Canada, implies that wartime Ukrainian nationalism is the same as the one of the contemporary diaspora. Well, Eva Moravska warns us against such this vision, and the diaspora cannot be seen as frozen in time. With her study, she demonstrates that representations of the homeland are very dynamic. Moreover, I argue that the concept of diaspora in diaspora studies should be always clearly defined, and usage of its broad meaning is more productive. The definition by Anthony Smith is very relevant here. He actually gives like 5 dimensions of nationalism, but I pay attention to 2 of them. So nationalism could be seen as a social or political movement on behalf of the nation. It should be distinguished from doctrine and ideology, which is another form of nationalism. Also, Brubaker and Cooper point out that identities are both the categories of social and political practice, and also categories of analysis, and a lot of researchers confuse this. As the categories of practice, national identity is used by political entrepreneurs to persuade people to understand themselves, their interest in a certain way, to organize and justify collective actions along certain lines. As the category of analysis, and it's mainly used in nationalism studies, it comes through certain symbols and discourses. But we should be not taking a nation for granted, so we shouldn't take it as a real community, as it's always socially constructed. If we take national community as real, it leads us to primordialism. Basically, the confusion of nationalism as a category of practice and analysis is very vivid in the study by Anders Per-Rudling. But what is national identity for Ukraine and respective diaspora communities? Well, Stephen Schulman argues that there are 2 main identity complexes or main meta-narratives for Ukrainians and Eastern Slavic people. First, national employs post-colonial framework defining Russia as an empire, whereas Belarus and Ukraine are seen as colonies. Here, Russia is seen as significant other. This identity, it's over here. This identity option may be seen as what Manuel Castells calls resistance identity. National history and vernacular languages basically challenge supranational ones. The supranational narrative is based on two types of historiographers, a Russophile and Sovietophile. Russophile tradition emerged in Tsarist times and was based on the ideas of monarchy and Russian Orthodoxy, and it is and implies from the Eastern Slavic unity. Sovietophile is focused on the Soviet past and can have elements of the communist ideology. In an extreme, as it's used by contemporary Russian regime today, it denies Ukrainian nationhood and statehood. Well, and we can see that, we can argue that in between these two meta-narratives, Ukrainian civic identity is somewhat squeezed and challenged. Also, in studies of imagined community and nationalism, there are risks. Well, Hassan Sage, in his study of Lebanese migrants, underlines the importance of the empirical evidence that community actually exists. So he puts this brilliantly. He imagined community seems to have very little community in it, and a lot of imagination instead, usually imagination of a researcher. Well, and also Shani Orgad makes a valid argument that the study of internet-related social phenomena always benefits from the investigation of, so to say, on the both sides of the screen, when on and offline data is combined. Keeping these theoretical arguments in mind and considering the risks, I developed the following methodological framework. In my study, theoretical sampling was employed. Basically, I was looking for virtual diasporic communities that were named Ukrainian. Then I made qualitative content analysis of the selected sites and social media groups. And also I examined personal public profiles, not all of them, but also with theoretical sampling of people who participate in these groups. I employed link analysis, which is partly based on social network analysis. Here I used the selected sites as a seed set, checked a node-node relationship between this set and pages and sites they are linked to. I also tried to follow these links and networks offline to see the nature of connections. After finding relevant communities, I was sort of moving from online to offline dimensions of social reality. The online data was combined with the data from offline. Here I employed as the main research instruments participant observation of events and expert interviews with the diaspora community organizers, activists, and scholars. And these roles often largely overlap. And the sites for my research were in Canada, Germany, United Kingdom, Czech Republic, and Hungary. The application of these methods led me to the following findings. Well, the Euromaidan and Russian aggression have embedded diaspora communities and organizations into a national movement that spans across borders. While the demands and activities during the Euromaidan were mainly political, after the Russian aggression, diaspora communities focused more on humanitarian support and volunteering. There is evidence of Ukraine fatigue and the emergence of horizontal networks of solidarity. So there is disappointment with the pace of reforms in Ukraine and with new government. At the same time, there are horizontal networks of solidarity made by diaspora communities that operate beyond governmental structures and diaspora organizations. In terms of national imagination, there is a quite clear divide between conservative and more civic diaspora communities. Also, local contexts of the host society significantly alter representations of national belonging. The Euromaidan and the war in Donbass is forcing diaspora communities to reinvent themselves in terms of national belonging to the homeland, as the homeland is more exposed to their attention and changing itself. The processes of such reinvention are ambivalent and far from being complete. So, Euromaidan was and is truly networked social movement where social media allowed constant involvement of the diaspora. Protest, online petitioning, Twitter storms, fundraising, and political lobbying, these are some of the main diaspora activities. After the first fatalities in Kiev in January 2014, growing share of humanitarian aid could be noticed. And this was even more noticeable after the armed conflict in Donbass ignited. Well, there is also the most numerous protests and rallies organized by diaspora communities took part in March 2014. Disillusionment with the new Ukrainian government, it's also quite obvious. And as a response, there is targeted assistance, which avoids Ukrainian state agencies, and a lot of support goes directly to volunteers in Ukraine. Also, there are a lot of initiatives which were planned as one-time occasions, but they transformed into sustainable initiatives, and they keep going supporting Ukraine. And of course, with the time and escalation of violence, there is some degree of demobilization also noticeable. Such involvement of diaspora boosted solidarity within diaspora communities themselves and provided the protesters with the feeling of support from abroad. Here is the picture of the protest in Times Square in New York, which was posted in the main Euromaidan group on Facebook. There are hundreds of pictures like this were posted, and these were shared by and appreciated by the supporters in Ukraine. So it's really allowed for this transnational solidarity to function. Moreover, there are interesting examples of how digital media spaces altered the genres of protests abroad. On the 16th of December 2013, Ukrainian journalist Sergei Leshchenko has posted on the site of Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian Truth, the address of the apartment of the richest Ukrainian oligarch, Rinat Akhmetov, and this apartment is in London. Here is the picture of the building in Knightsbridge. Actually, this apartment is one of the most expensive in the United Kingdom. So this news was discussed in London Euromaidan group, and in 2 days later, a protest was organized near this apartment to force Akhmetov to respond. And this still continues. There are still protests taking place, but this is really a powerful example of how the information actually travels freely across national borders. Moreover, there are well, the collapse of the Yanukovych regime and after it, diaspora's activists find it quite difficult to help homeland, especially if some governmental officials are involved. As one activist in Canada notes, the first part, I will skip it, but it's really illustrates double loyalties to the homeland and the local diaspora community. So the second part, I will read it. This is an interesting question. In Ukraine, there is more trust in volunteers in personal context rather than institutions. And it is the opposite here in Canada. But I know that if we send money to some organization or state agency, it will disappear. But when there are trusted people, trusted personal contact, we can be sure that the money will be used properly. It really shows that there is a lot of communication and support going on. Moreover, the armed conflict raised the stakes of involvement with the homeland dramatically, and this has definitely made a challenge in terms of degree of commitment. In this interview with the activist from the UK, also some disappointments reflected. I will skip this part about Kaskiv, but I will go with the second one. You know, I still bring a few sets of binoculars for them in London Euromaidan to send them over, some crutches for the wounded. There is no disassociation, there is no rejection. There is kind of recognition that emotionally it is easy way of dealing with things. as I know there are those who are laying their lives for Ukraine when they could easily immigrate to Canada. Sometimes I feel that I'm not playing full part. I may not play any part at all. I still do things. I'm the drop in the ocean, as I remember from the Euromaidan. You know, the Twitter storm. There are people out there really doing stuff intellectually and physically. And then there is one, oh, I will send a tweet. And this is a bit pathetic. So we really can see that the violence in Donbass and the war really makes all other efforts looking not as important as before. And here is the main page of the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain. And you can see there is a special section dedicated to this Twitter storm campaign over there. And it was created during Euromaidan. And later initiative Patriot Defense, its international initiative to bring armored vests to Ukrainian soldiers. So, there are a lot of collections going on and done by more new community London Euromaidan, which really consists of representatives of all and new diaspora as well. So here is their collection. You can see different groups, and this whole collection is sort of reinforced by the portrait of Stepan Bandera. So let's look at, and Stepan Bandera obviously is a very important symbol and person for Ukrainian national imagination. So let's look at national imagination of diaspora communities more closely. Well, my study suggests that there is a visible divide between conservative and civic diaspora communities that is reflected by the icons of nationalism. For the former ones, these are Stepan Bandera, wartime leader of Ukrainian nationalists, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Also, commemoration of Holodomor is very important symbol. And also Ukrainian language and ethnic arts play a crucial role. For the latter, they rely more on democratization discourse. They try to distance themselves from symbols of wartime nationalism, try to integrate Russian speakers and non-ethnic Ukrainians. They also focus more on showcasing and representation of contemporary Ukrainian art. Well, my doctoral study in the UK suggests that local organizations developed a hegemonic discourse based on the Banderite faction mythology after the war, and it's pretty much the dominant in the main organizations over there. So it's not a surprise that references both to Ukrainian insurgent army and contemporary right sector, this red and black flags, were very visible, very noticeable, and still very noticeable in the protest in London, like on this picture. Well, but at the same time, there is growing solidarity with Crimean Tatars. And this was not that visible before. Basically, the occupation of Crimea forced this. And it's really unprecedented support and expression of solidarity. Basically, what is unique that Crimean Tatars now represented as an important, crucial part of the Ukrainian nation. And another demonstration of this. So here is the commemoration of the deportation of Crimean Tatars organized near the monument of Saint Volodymyr in London. Well, but then there is, of course, the reality itself challenges the ideas of integral nationalism and the idea of Ukrainian for Ukraine, as we really should acknowledge the importance of such identity as Afro-Ukrainian identity, for instance. Yeah, and this boy, and there are many examples of debates and really negotiation of this new identity. Also, the processes of reinvention of national belonging are well reflected in online visual materials. Here, the announcement of the Day of the Heroes by AUGB. You can see the portraits of heroes from the past Yevhen Konoval, Stepan Bandera. They are combined with the pictures of contemporary heroes. This iconic picture of the Heaven 100, those protesters who were shot in the Maidan Square in Kiev in 2014. So this picture is from 2014. This is next one. Yeah, it's even more interesting. We have this picture of Heaven 100 to make the main background, and it also features the poppy. It's very novel symbol for Ukraine. Actually, it was to replace Soviet symbols of victory, and also to shift from the Soviet narrative of the Second World War and victory over fascism to the Day of Remembrance and Reconciliation. And this is really important just because the victory in the Second World War was not that much acknowledged by this community before, when I was writing when I was doing my doctoral study. Well, the next year, this poppy disappears, but the picture is still there. Basically, we see how this national imagination transforms in order to unite the histories, the old narratives, and the new ones. Well, as I said before, there is very important to pay attention to local national context of the host societies. And they really alter and change many things, both in terms of practice of diaspora communities and in terms of representation. So, well, in the Czech Republic, I mean, the revolution of dignity had very particular meaning. This is a long quote, but I will read it in full. Very different people were coming to the Euromaidan protests in Prague. As I could observe and assume, most of people back in Ukraine, these people never participated in demonstrations, not to say about Czech Republic. They were not politically active. You could see many people's workers' hands, and sometimes they were dressed as they came directly from a construction site. There were many people saying something. It is great that there are so many of us, and Czech people cannot just ignore us. So for them, their identity, it was very important to overcome a certain stigma of being Ukrainian in Czech Republic. So to say that you are Ukrainian is not that comfortable over here. But when you're just saying, not just saying that you're Ukrainian, but walking in the old town with the Ukrainian flag, shouting "Glory to the nation, death to the enemy, loves." There were people like this. We try to explain to them that it's not a very good thing to say, and it's good that Czechs do not understand what exactly we are shouting. So for them, it was the moment of empowerment. This helped a lot. And it was very helpful that the emphasis of Czech people were on our side. So it's interview from 2015. At the same time, other activists in Prague, they feel that they have to educate the host society about wartime nationalism, and then it would be accepted. So another activist saying the following: yes, we have books about Bandera. Before they were Czechs, they were very afraid of red and black flag because they were thinking that it is related to fascism, and for them it was unacceptable that people come to the Maidan with such flags. Only blue and yellow flags were accepted. But when we telling them that what it is, who Bandera was, what kind of movement it was, they changed their views. They were even making fun with the business cards of Yarosh. Yeah, it's another like internet meme, a big story in the Ukraine crisis. There are books and they are all translated, but they do not sell them freely. There is one man who studied Bandera and he makes a lot of meetings and appearances on TV. He is a historian, he is Czech, and he speaks perfect Ukrainian. And he tells on TV all the truth. Now Czechs know more about Yarosh and Bandera. So it's the idea that we just have to educate people and then, to make all symbols acceptable. This education, however, is not always possible, like in the case of Germany, as one of the activists from over there saying, well, there were red and black flags here in Berlin Euromaidan. I cannot say that this is something that Germans very appreciate. Also, translating some slogans can be tricky. For instance, when you translate Ukraine is above all, Ukraina ponad uсе, into German, it is nearly the same as Deutschland über alles, which is not something you want to say in this country at all. We do everything we can for Ukraine to become a free and democratic country. It is good to avoid World War II divides. We have to look in the future and not to be stuck in the past. Generally, Germany and Berlin in particular is a unique case, as all diaspora organizations disappeared over there in the 1990s. And there are only new organizations now. They rely heavily on social media. They include Russian speakers and non-ethnic Ukrainians, such as Ukrainian Jewish people. For instance, the group Ukrainians in Berlin has the following description. I will not go through it in the whole, but this group serves for establishing of context and facilitation of connection of Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Berliners. So it really implies this inclusivity. Another group is the Ukrainian Cinema Club, which has similar mindset, and it's focused on showcasing of contemporary Ukrainian cinema to the German society. Well, and activists over there think about a lot about branding contemporary Ukraine in Germany, as stressed by one of the activists. I have attended one of the Ukrainian World Congress meetings in Kiev. And I was very surprised that they think that we have to tell the world about sharovar, about borscht, and about Cossacks. I know that this is not interesting to Germans. They're interested in the contemporary culture. You can wear a vyshyvanka, but it's ornamented Ukrainian shirt. But you should do something interesting like reading contemporary Ukrainian literature at the same time. When no one knows what Ukraine is, and who are our philosophers, who are our film directors, who are our writers, to just stand in vyshyvanka is just to boost your own ego without any result. They will show this on Ukrainian TV, but they will never show this on German TV. Germans do not understand Ukraine as a subjectivity, and then this interview goes that we have actually put Ukraine on the mental map of German society. We made a flash mob during the Euromaidan near the Brandenburg gates. We were standing in different locations and we were reading Ukrainian literature in German. This was not easy to do, but this was cool and we have attracted a lot of attention. More attention if we would just wear vyshyvanki. Diaspora is closed and I do not like this, so there is some detachment to be ascribed to diaspora. We welcome people of all backgrounds who can do something interesting and who can promote the good name or brand of Ukraine. Well, and to carry on with the lecture by Ernest last week, there is a challenge in terms of the Ukrainian Jewish diasporic identity. There is one activist who was not active before and joined really after Euromaidan started. And this is a very prominent volunteer who travels to the front lines and also musician who plays to the soldiers and including volunteer battalions. So the quotation reads, no, there was no Azov for sure. Azov is one of the volunteer battalions with quite controversial reputation. And I played for them, for volunteer battalions, and I openly told them that one composition is a Jewish prayer. I told them that I'm a Ukrainian of Jewish religion, and I cannot pray with the Christian tradition, but I will pray for you the way I can. And this was accepted. It was accepted very positively. Of course, I could see that some people struggle with this and had some shock. If someone would ask me, I would say I do not support neither the ideology of own nor the right sector. But if there is an opportunity for contact, I will use it because I want to enlighten them. If we want to be a democratic country, we cannot get rid of these people. We have to educate these people. I believe in free, democratic, and independent Ukraine. Well, it's really interesting, this new national belonging and new forms of diaspora community. And now we can go to the North America. And yeah, there is huge diversity here. And yeah, I will begin with the quote from the recent article of the former president of Ukrainian World Congress, I.Kozachenko. Organized Jewish community in Ukraine never supported Ukraine's aspirations, in particular independence. In the period after the World War I, not a single Jewish party supported the independence of Ukraine. This absence of empathy was also obvious during the last revolution of 2013-2014, when a very small number of organized Jewish communities were taking part in the revolution, and those who did participate were speaking Russian. Yeah, well, as illustrated by the previous quotes and a lot of data I have, this is quite challenging argument. And also, the national imagination of diaspora communities in Canada is not exclusively national. For instance, the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians clearly articulates supranational imagination, which is based on communist ideology. And they represent the conflict in Ukraine rather than as a class struggle or struggle between oligarchs, and not really active in condemning the Russian aggression. They also promote different groups like this one, the New Cold War, Ukraine and Beyond. And this group actually is quite nostalgic for the Soviet times. Sort of, it's really represents the Soviet past in very positive terms. But then we always have to separate the representation of national identities in practice. So the director of representative office of the Ukrainian World Congress in Ukraine has taken part in this initiative, and there was a meeting on the 7th of July 2015 in the town of Slavyansk. This is a town in eastern Ukraine that was liberated from pro-Russian separatists. And the meeting was like really discussing the future of Ukraine's nation and the problems to solve the conflict. And he stressed that Ukrainians should not be focused on the language, religion, and other divides, and they really should use the idea of Maidan. So this is an appeal to this more civic, more inclusive identity. He also takes an active part in the reanimation package of reform. This is a huge initiative aimed at reforming and implementing many law initiatives, and there is a huge variety. And this is really big democratic movement. Yeah, well, also the imagination of multicultural Ukraine is quite complicated in the context of Canadian diaspora. So, yeah, this is the quotes from the site of the League of Ukrainian Ukrainian Canadians. So, one of the collective mission is safeguard and further development the multicultural identity, civic institutions, and democratic values at the core of Canadian society. This is one statement. And then, like in the section called "The Future," the goal is to bring the social and political values to Ukraine that make Canada the envy of the world. Democracy, human rights, rule of law, civil society, tolerance, respect for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. What is lost from Multiculturalism. It's actually one of the great values of Canadian society, but it's this vision that Canada can be multicultural, but Ukraine cannot. But there is very significant change taking place in the community anyways. As noticed by all experts that I interviewed in Canada, one of them tells the following story. And that's, I think of one story that reflects the change. In the Orthodox Sobor that was held in July 2015 in Winnipeg, there was a presentation of a short documentary film, like 20 minutes, about the Ukrainian Orthodox priest from Kiev Patriarchy from Zaporizhia, who ministers to the troops in the ATO. ATO, it's anti-terrorist operations, basically how the conflict in Ukraine is called officially. Goes to front lines and so on. The film showed him, and everywhere he went, he was speaking Russian, with the soldiers in the front line positions. He does the service in Ukrainian, but he was, he was warmly received. I would say that, and the film and the fact that this priest was speaking Russian, I would say that 10 or 20 years ago, there would be people at the Sobor who would stand up and ask, why do they speak Russian? And so on. At that time, they were proud and they were pleased to see. They accepted this. I think that this was a huge change in the community to understand that someone is more comfortable linguistically speaking Russian. And another example, language really at the core of this debate. One of the radio DJs of Ukrainian radio tells the following story. Well, there was an interview of one volunteer on Radio Svoboda, Radio Freedom. It was a very important interview, and I decided to have it broadcasted on our channel. And it was in Russian. And there was no complaints after it. Not a single one. If I did this before the Euromaidan, I would be crucified for doing this. Lots. Well, but still, from other interviews, in terms of organization and real communal lives, there is a lot of resistance towards Russian speaking. One of the community organizers said the following: we are a Ukrainian speaking organization, and those who speak Russian can do this somewhere else. And also there was an interesting question during the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress meeting in Regina last year. Why there are, and this was addressed to the panel of including foreign minister, deputy foreign minister, and two vice prime ministers from Ukraine. Why there are even more people who speak the language of the occupier, the Russian language, in Ukraine after Maidan? Well, at the same time, there are really new groups emerging online, and these try to be more inclusive towards Russian-speaking Ukrainians or different religious denominations. Like this group of Ukrainians in Canada. The description reads, this group is for those who come from Ukraine and for those who identify themselves with Ukraine. It doesn't matter what language you speak, and it doesn't matter what church you're going to or not going to at all. So there are attempts to build diaspora community in more civic terms. But of course, it's very dynamic and long way to go. So resting on all above, it is possible to draw some conclusions. Diaspora communities should be analyzed on the basis of their national imagination and on the basis of their social and political practice. As my study demonstrates, it's not that straightforward connection between those. Also, the impact of the Russian aggression is ambivalent. So there is obviously boosted solidarity and sort of reinvented and reinforced national sentiment. At the same time, the Russian aggression gave a very direct meaning, say, for the expression as occupier's language. I mean, it's reinforced previously existing prejudices and myths. New digital media provides diaspora communities with an opportunity to create transnational connections that actually are alternative to previously existing vertical organizational structures. And this is quite clear. While before there was needed to create some vertical structure with some management. There is a lot of grassroots initiatives and organization going on, and social media over here is really crucial. While there are similarities between conservative and civic diaspora communities in terms of practice, the former ones struggle to overcome limitations set by their ideological doctrines. Whether these new communities will be sustainable in the future, we'll see. I mean, like all communities have proven that this ethnic sentiment really puts very strong bonds and allows the recreation of communities, and how this, so to say, civic communities will operate in the future. I mean, it's the subject for research. I mean, for future research, there are several directions which I have not focused in this particular study. Well, there is biographical level, diaspora as a type of consciousness and self-understanding. We really can look at how these diasporic identities on biographical level fit the collective identities on the one hand of communities and collective national identities. So this is like really big thing to study in the future. Also, it is very noticeable the role of religious identity. I mean, the Russian aggression is boosted by the concept of the Russian world, which is Orthodox, and it was first sort of explained in the public sphere by the Patriarch of Moscow. At the same time, there are different divides and there is struggle between religious identity and secular identities. So this is very important dimension. Then we really can look at post-Soviet diaspora communities. How these new communities were divided, or whether they were divided. What is the mechanism for this division and reasons after the crisis? Just because obviously this kind of loose Russian-speaking post-Soviet communities were forced to take sides. And there is a lot of things going on at the same time. Well, then there is like structural change in Ukraine in terms of democratization and the impact of diaspora. This is one of the directions I currently work on and hope to present the findings of this direction of my research in the future. And I haven't touched, or touched just a little bit, the issue of old and new diaspora, of different ways of immigration. This also provides really a lot of things to look at. So I want to finish my presentation with the citation by Craig Calhoun. It is the very nature of democracy that it should exist in plural forms, created by different people as they struggle with different circumstances. Nations reflects communities not merely of fate, but of mutual and collective responsibility. And I believe that this collective responsibility will provide very positive results for both for diaspora and for Ukraine itself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Unless you'd like to take a pause.
Thank you.
When you do that, I will open the floor up for any questions.
Yeah, sure. Apologies for my voice, I'm not sick. I have a question about a thing which is missing or not in your presentation about, or if you're trying to include it in your research, the mention of how successful or how unsuccessful were diaspora attempts after Euromaidan. For example, spreading knowledge about Ukraine or influencing the public opinion in their host countries. About this kind of efforts. Just like an anecdotal evidence, I mean, you can get 1,000 likes on Facebook for posting Putin law, but that doesn't really change anything in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question. I mean, it's the concept of success. It's how we really define it. There is definitely. I mean, the effort and the humanitarian aid is immense, and there are so many things which are going on, and sometimes it's complicated to trace like direct link. Obviously, the main resources are possessed by national governments, so we really can measure success on the basis of the reactions on or lobbying of the interest of the homeland by diasporas. This is would be, you know, in terms of real direct help, it would be the main indicator of success. Say, as Canada taking sanctions, providing direct assistance, and so on. Then, of course, we can try to do discourse analysis in the host countries. And then in these discourses, we can really see how, actually it's in my interviews, but I could not present it just due to time constraints. There is really a lot of going on in terms of fighting propaganda and previously existing stereotypes. Coming back to the example of Germany, it's an important one. So my interviewees were really telling me a lot that Ukraine is not on the mental map of Germans. And for Germans, the trauma of the Second World War and Nazism, it really boosts and provides like fertile soil for the Russian propaganda. So they feel guilty towards Russia, but they not feel guilty towards Ukraine. So just because they really excluded from the Second World War narrative or in their imagination. So there is a lot of efforts is going on to battle the Russian propaganda, and yeah, I think there are changes. If good indicator could be like TV programs, which is like mass media and appearances, and this could be another direction of analysis, just because social media still represent quite specific segment of information society, but this could be an indicator of success. If we see more, the topic is discussed and more people representing diaspora appear on public TV, this is important. So, yeah, I mean, I haven't focused on this particularly, but a lot of achievements could be seen. I mean, like reaching politicians, making politicians take inside of Ukraine, collecting immense amount of humanitarian aid. It happens. And yeah, I hope I answered your question. It's unfortunately it's not like direct research questions I asked.
Okay, Frank, and then I'll turn to you.
First is the comment on Germany. The German-Ukrainian Historical Commission was formed largely by the shock of German historians finding out these kind of attitudes in Germany and seeing them not only among people in general, but even among their fellow historians in Germany. That is no feeling of guilt towards Ukraine. I might add that when we did this first Maidan petition that went into the Guardian that Serakovsky put in, they tried to get Habermas to sign the petition, and he said, I still remember when tanks went eastward, and therefore I can't sign it. And then someone tried to point it out to them, where did the tanks go? You know, but of course he didn't think of this as Ukraine. So I think very deeply ingrained. Then just a comment on your Berlin and in Germany, how different it would look if you were talking about Munich, where people go to the opera dressed in national costumes, where many of the same customs that come largely from that Central European zone. I've often argued that from Lviv to Munich is one cultural sphere, and KU and Berlin are in different cultural spheres in some way. So that is, I think that kind of differentiation, you know, when you say Germany and then Berlin, well, it's certainly not the Bavarian context. And then the real question of this, the push factor. One of the things we see in Toronto, and I go frequently over to the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, which has become the center of political activity for the Russian diaspora, is that it would be almost untenable for anyone with even minimal Ukrainian feeling to stay in that community anymore. That is, they are basically pushing a large number of formerly inactive in the Ukrainian community, Russian speakers, and people who made very little interest out. And the same way as orthodoxy becomes more important in the Russian community, they are pushing elements of Russian-speaking Jews in Toronto away from them. So I wonder how, when you do this, the study of this combination, and then this will be my final one, and then a little trouble by your binary lists of the old and the new emigration, because I think so many people cross back and forth a number of times in their speaking, and you've got all kinds of link groups. You have the large number of Galician Ukrainians here who are fourth wave, you know, who sort of are between these two kinds of visions and go back and forth. So I think it's a little dangerous. And the Holodomor, who does, maybe is a symbol of victimization in the West, but does seem to draw in certain elements from Eastern Ukraine who come in the fourth wave. So I think if you'd comment about how you feel about those two lists. So one, the push factor and how you're going to do that, and two, this division of these lists. Sorry for so many.
Thank you very much, Professor Sisson. Yeah, it's very good comments. And with Germans, it's definitely to dealing with some cultural trauma of the nation. I mean, so in terms of reaching and educating, there are opportunities. I mean, the resources of diaspora is quite limited, as you mentioned. There is even academic tradition related to this. And,
but there's more Ukrainian literature translated into German than into English. So they have a basic stock to deal with, which we can't even dream of in the English-speaking world, because Germans translate. And so we have most Ukrainian many writers are already in German and not in English, which is amazing.
The second moment, it's really important. You are right. I mean, if strictly speaking, I shouldn't put Germany as a research site. I should put Berlin which is a global city and very specific in terms of Ukrainian diasporas. And in the interviews I did, really, I mean, a lot of people were saying that, what is going on over here is super different from Munich. There is completely different story over there. So I agree that my generalization towards all Germany, no, it's quite shaky. But I try to make this big comparative analysis, so I come to certain limitations. And if to study Germany, I definitely have to have a closer look and to do some research in Munich. In terms of push factors, I mean, they all over the place, and especially when everything is so heated by the conflict. I mean, people become very radicalized, and I can see this in my study, and this is the challenge to develop. With all atrocities which are going on, it is important to develop some mechanisms of inclusion, and a lot of things, are going on. Definitely, as you mentioned, the Russian Orthodox Church, Russia weaponized Orthodoxy, as well as Russian language and many other aspects as a memory about Second World War and then Soviet memory. And I think it's a major challenge for conservative but super important diaspora organizations to do something. But I can see that it's very complicated, if possible at all, for them to change. I mean, there were these ethnic boundaries and prejudices that were shaping them for so long. I do not. We'll see. They're possible. I rather see, and I have some evidence from countries without old diasporas, and these countries have very vibrant, very strong new communities, such as Portugal, Spain, and Italy. So in a way, these ideological and doctrinal constraints, they do not allow social reproduction of community when for different reasons people are pushed away. Then the community itself exists for very long, but it becomes quite dysfunctional. I mean, ASGB doesn't possess that much resources, and the most of protests, they were by recent immigrants, so which operated in parallel to this old diaspora organizations. In contrast, in those countries where Czech Republic is an example, where there was no this big organizations and old organizations who speak of, who are entitled to represent the people, there was more dynamic and more diverse and more effective mechanisms. It's what I would say. Concerning my somewhat simplified classification, I mean, I operate this. First of all, identity is something socially constructed and used by researchers. People don't think what my identity, what it is. You really make them to articulate it in a certain way or can spot it. And diasporic identity is always hybrid. So I just stressed the aspects of identity which I find relevant in terms of being connected to national discourses in Ukraine and the community itself. But of course, there is a huge overlap in terms of identities, in terms of practices. So yeah, I definitely, in my writing, I stress that the hybridity and the inclusion of different elements. And also the lines between communities, they're really fluid. So it's what actually I try to avoid, is to represent diasporas as something stable and frozen. I hope I answered.
Yes,
There's a question there at the back.
Yeah, clear up a few things in my mind anyway. You mentioned that you were doing a research on the 4-year doctorate, is that correct?
It was before, yeah. It's
So the research that you were doing for your doctorates is what you presented here, in part.
yeah, this is a postdoctoral project which is much more complicated.
Okay, yeah.
It's not focused exclusively on the United Kingdom as it was before when I was.
Yeah, and the information you obtained for your research was through social media, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, mostly through social media?
Not only. I explained the methodology. It's like quite. There are like different instruments.
I'm asking these questions actually because it seems to me that we're trying to promote a modern diaspora in Ukraine. The modern diaspora would speak any language. They would use Russian or any other language. They would do modern things. And by modern, I guess we mean the things that the West does, rather than the things that Russia would do, for example. And I think actually what we're missing out on is our commitment, because you mentioned success. Success means meeting our commitments. And what is our commitments? I thought it was social justice in Ukraine. And if you leave out social justice completely, we're not going anywhere in Ukraine. Absolutely nowhere. We know that the history of Ukraine has been altered by Russia drastically. I mean, we all know that. So to base a thesis on modern thinking without going to the past, in my view, actually, the past is sacred. Today is a gift, and tomorrow is just another day. We have to learn from the past. And we have to commit ourselves to getting some justice done. That's just my comment.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, like in terms of past, it's also a lot of big concepts you use. I think an important thing about past that we have to learn lessons and we have to correct mistakes of the past. That's why we have to study and sometimes be critical about past. Otherwise, we won't learn the lesson. So it's a major challenge for Ukraine itself to avoid mistakes that were made in the past. And it's also a big challenge for diaspora also to learn from mistakes of the past and to carry on in the future in a better form.
See, my background is engineering. The basis of design, the principle behind design is trial and error. And that's all past stuff. If we don't learn from our trial and error, we will never perfect our engineering. We will never perfect the design. We could never do it.
Okay, I have five questions. I think we may have to stop. We'll see. So in terms of order, Roman, Alexander, Igor, Paul, and Elena.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for a very interesting presentation. To my knowledge, this is the first time I'm aware of comparative study across all these countries after Euromaidan, so I think this is a very interesting, your original work. Now, what was very important to me were these definitions of diaspora that were put forward. And I think it's very significant because in Canada there is a tendency to equate diaspora studies with ethnic studies. So questions of multiculturalism and diaspora studies seem to be on the same continuum, but I think you made it clear that diaspora studies are something quite distinct from ethnic studies. And you then went on to talk about different models of diaspora, and you focused both on the virtual world and the real world. Now, the question I guess I'd like to ask has to do with the very nature of the Euromaidan phenomenon. As I recall, political parties were displaced from Euromaidan. It was a national movement, perhaps a national liberation movement, even. So, as I listened, I did not hear any reference from these interviews to any Ukrainian political parties. Similarly, I did not hear any reference to political, economic issues or social issues. So you quite rightly emphasized that your talk was about identity, that is, cultural identity, personal, social identity, but it really could not delve into the social structures of diaspora. So I guess my question leads me to ask, if this movement is at such a high level of generalization, national liberation, and it does not discuss social or economic issues, according to your interview, is very rare. They're concerned mostly with identity, particularly in relationship to the countries they're in. Then it's condemned to be short-lived. It does not have the potential for intergenerational continuity. Like if there's no organizations formed, if there's no credit unions formed, if there's no Ridni Shkoly formed, if there's no representative bodies formed, then the next major event in Ukraine will replace Euromaidan. Mm-hmm. And this consciousness, this particular identity will simply be a footnote. Now, do you agree with me on this or not?
Thank you for this question, Professor Patricia. I mean, it's true. I mean, it's a lot about designing research as well. First of all, political parties and particular political discourse are reflected in this. It was just not the focus of this presentation. And there are a lot of examples could be made. Say in Prague there is International Svoboda. It's sort of like an office of Svoboda party from Ukraine. This national, like ultra-nationalist party. And there were activists representing this party in Euromaidan. So there was like sort of own right sector or own ultra-nationalists over there. And that was like a bit a challenge. Those like some speakers were giving speeches which were, if they would be translated, they would be not like accepted by the Czech audience. So very radical in a way. Then, as to think about national movement and transformational power, I don't think that for a national movement or any social movement, I mean, there are these social movements who are like concerned with particular problems, and this possess really clear strategic plan of economic and political change. And like Indignados in Spain, and others, they targeting like or occupy Wall Street or others. They really have a plan or have a proposition for economic change, say, or social justice. But when we speak of national movement, I mean the idea of nation is always so broad that it's quite complicated to equate some initiatives by some groups embedded in social movement and to say that, look, this is what all social movement means. This reanimation of package of reforms, it's really one of the biggest sustainable movements with a huge involvement of diaspora. And it's actually like, this initiative consists of hundreds, if not thousands, particular plans for change. And for them, it's a really technical challenge, and not even technical, I mean like structural challenge to deal with corrupt politicians and political resistance in Ukraine. Whether in terms of sustainability, I don't think that we should remove or say that Euromaidan is a national movement, and then when it ceased to exist in its current form, it's end of national movement. No, there would be other ideas. Big part of my research was the question: how do you think what people participating in Euromaidan think of Europe? How Europe is represented? And there is a lot of things people were mentioning. And this was quite direct in terms of economic change, in terms of judicial system, and this was much more precise. In terms of direct plans, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I mean, like, there was very highly skilled professional from all diaspora from the UK. And he told me that he actually went to Kiev and tried to reach the ministers his skills applicable to, and saying, look guys, I actually will use my skills. I have savings. I don't need your salary. I can do something. And he was told, no, thank you. Go back to the UK. I mean, this is a really complicated interplay. And this definitely important issue, but it somewhat goes beyond the scope of my study. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Alexander?
Just a brief comment and a question. Regarding the Germany above everything, I think it's the starting line of the contemporary anthem. So I have heard about this allegation that it connects to Nazi symbolism, but I think it might have contemporary origins. So I check that. The question concerns to follow up on Professor Sisson's question about the religion. In reviewing sort of interviews and testimonies with rebels in the Donbass, they often evolve this Orthodox images. Sometimes where body crosses often describes themselves as Orthodox, and obviously some of the titles of their armed formations refer to Orthodoxy. I was wondering, how does the question of religion and identity reflect on the Ukrainian side? My impression is not to the same degree. Is religion present at all in say, the war factor or the activities of the civilian society and volunteer groups on the Ukrainian side?
Thank you. Good question. I mean, I paid this attention to identity as category of practice and unit of analysis. And also, we should stress that identity is not only socially constructed, they are performed. To use the terminology of Irving Goffman, of a famous sociologist, I mean, performed his social social drama sort of analysis of interactions, when people actually perform something, and identities are also performed in a way. So sometimes social actors are cynical, sort of, they detach themselves from the social role. I do this just because I want to seem so. And sometimes they do not detach themselves from the role. They are playing sort of with believing that the role is them. And it's very relevant to this idea of orthodoxy, this Orthodox army, one unit was called Russian Orthodox Army in Donbass and so on. and then the general discourse of this spirituality in Russia and Orthodox foundation and spiritual bonds and so on. But there are only 3% of Russians attending churches regularly, on regular basis. So behind this discourse, there is not much going on. Or, I mean, like, talking of spirituality, we can take statistics and see that, yeah, this country is one of the leading on the planet in terms of abortions. So it's not a lot of done in terms of following religious rules. So we always have to distinguish what is put forward to showcase the identity and what the social practice is. And yeah, I mean, definitely for Ukrainians, there is this big internal discourse in terms of Kiev Patriarchate and creating an independent church as one of the foundations of independent identity. But then there is the diversity in terms of Ukrainian Christianity as well, Union Church, Orthodox, and so on. I mean, I think for Ukraine it would be quite divisive as any other sort of fluid identities to utilize this for the purposes of mobilization or stigmatization of the opposing side. That's why, I mean, like, if to think in instrumental terms, it doesn't possess that much of mobilizing power as it for Russia, just because it's like really important narrative of spirituality and so on. So I think over here, more like structural factors are important. But as Professor Sisson mentioned, I mean, parishes generate social capital. It's a very important aspect of communal life. And I mean, in the studies on social capital, it shows that people possess more social capital when they attend churches. And it's not just because they become more spiritual, just because they become more engaged in community. So in this sense, I think church possesses a lot of mobilization power. I mean, like this sort of local grassroots mobilization for local community to be united in some opinion and in some perceptions of what's going on. I hope I answered your question.
You know, I think just one thing on it. I think one of the most amazing things have been the switch of linguistic symbolism. The argument against using Ukrainian in churches was always that you don't want in church the language of the bazaar. But of course, now the language of the bazaar in central and eastern Ukraine is Russian. And Ukrainian then becomes a sacred language, rarely used for sacred occasions. And I thought of this at the Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral this Easter, when I would guess 1/3 of the people there were Russian speakers. But all of course, perfectly happy to go to Ukrainian liturgies in language. So it now becomes not the language, your normal language is Russian, but now your sacred language is Ukrainian. And so we've got this tremendous cultural switch that's gone on the Ukrainian side. I mean, it's a side issue, but I just, sorry.
I have a few points that I'd like to raise, and I was particularly taken with one of your opening slides where you talked about one of the problems being the researchers themselves. And as we know, we all bring our own lenses to whatever we look at. And when you showed the posters for Święto Herojów in England, the lens I looked with it from was my former lens, where I was for 2 years the Kultusvitny referent, or the person responsible with the portfolio for cultural and educational matters at the AUGB in Derby, the Derby branch, to which Western-on-Trent and Stasiuk belongs. And I saw there simply practical, that they may have had a poster designed, they didn't want to know what to do, they reused it for another year. So unless you've actually spoken to the organizers themselves, I'd be wary about making comments about the purpose of why those things are there and why perhaps the property has been taken away. Which leads me to my next point, and as there are still vestiges, like I know the AUGB is the largest organization, always prided themselves on being the best, but there are still vestiges in England of the Objednanie Ukraińców w Wielkiej Brytanii. And I'm wondering whether you actually made any efforts to get comments from those people too. Which leads me to my next point. With your activists, always I was wondering, particularly in the English situation, because I lived it. There are people of my generation, and then there are people of your generation who are called novopribuli, who ones who have just come to England and who've set up almost parallel organizations in which some of whose activities I've attended. So it would be nice to have a context of what kind of activists you talk to, which then leads me to the next point about there is an institute in the Lviv Polytechnic for contacts with diaspora, MIOC, led by Kulchitska and Kalinets. I had an occasion to spend some time with them, and they talked to me about the two totally different diasporas, the ones of Ukrainians who economically left Ukraine and have ended up in Europe, who always dream of returning one day to a Ukraine. They've just gone because they need to earn money. They couldn't earn money in Ukraine, versus the ones who have come to North America, who basically have those who came to North America are ones who could have succeeded in Ukraine no matter what. They've actually come to be assimilated into the North American way of life. So again, is there a different viewpoint between the different kind of activists, which then circles me right back to your title. Should you be talking about Ukrainian diaspora, or as a linguist, should you be using the plural diasporas?
Thank you very much. It's really a lot of things to say about. Actually, with Sergey, we have a debate, this linguistic debate. I mean, my PhD was called Eastern Slavic Diasporas in the UK, the Making of Communities. So it was plural. But then, like, I mean, whether we should use diaspora communities or diasporas. And so sometimes Sergey corrects me.
In this particular case, we use diaspora communities, but Ivan originally did have the plural for the title.
And
So that answers the last question.
a lot of, first of all, about this image. I mean, it would be very misleading to assume some, I mean, like to have too much imagination of yourself. I mean, why they did this. I mean, the fact of representation is important. I mean, the fact that they selected this in order to advertise this event. Of course, more research, I mean, there are limited resources to reach everyone, unfortunately. And I haven't reached the Объединение. Actually, I did my fieldwork in London only. And it's also for the, just because Eastern Slavs include Ukrainian, Russians, and Belarusians exist as an organized community in London. So for me, it would be methodologically misleading, you know, like to research Ukrainians in Edinburgh and Russians in Glasgow, and then Belarusians in London. So I did within one research site. And now I focused more on Euromaidan protests. And of course, they were taking places all over the place, in Bradford and in Edinburgh, and I mean, I focused on London more. So, and for me, the fact of involvement into Euromaidan protests was quite a defining factor. So I tried to reach people who were active both offline and online, sort of, in terms of participation. And this represents, different waves and different groups of diaspora. And diaspora is always plural, it's true. I mean, the categories of people, even to being raised in different parts of the UK would make a difference. And of course, they should never be equated with, say, Canadian diasporas. All, especially individual experiences are unique. But in terms of national representation, I am focused on these uses, what symbols are put forward. And I always try to do these cross-checks with offline data. Unfortunately, it's not always possible. There are some limits in terms of resources. But thank you for telling me about all these activities, and I hope to provide more systematic study of the United Kingdom and Ukrainian diasporas over there in the future.
Yeah, there's a couple of people who have their hands up who haven't spoken yet. It's Paul, Olena, Yaz, whether you would like questions. I'll give an opportunity to those people who haven't asked questions at first, and we'll see how time goes.
I get it.
I just want to make a short comment, and that comment is about learning from history, because it's one, we need to learn from history, but we must also have an ultimate goal, an ultimate destination. We must have a vision of where we're going to, and it's not like, okay, we're going to just correct this mistake, and hopefully we don't keep making endless mistakes, because there must, that's the whole idea of a revolution, is that it must have a goal, and revolutions cannot be sustained if there's not an end goal and a vision of what is the ideal that we were striving towards. So I think it's very important to keep in mind a goal. And if we look at scripture, people without a vision, they will perish. So we can see that this idea of having, of striving is really critical. And I would suggest that that's something that the Ukrainians have yet to develop, because you have various episodes, but there must be, at least intellectually, there must be continuity that goes on and on, in which, look, we can see actual progress, and that there has to be confidence that progress is being achieved. And young people in Ukraine, I was on a train speaking with a young person, and she commented to me that she didn't, like, Ukraine is a dying nation. So, and just heard recently another comment in which it was on, I just forget the exact background of this stuff, in which young people were wondering whether they had a future, like, because of what was all going on. So there has to be, we have to keep in mind that there has to be this, that Ukraine is actually a pivotal nation. It can set an example for the world how to overcome great obstacles, but we still have not yet. We have to keep going stubbornly. That's my comment.
Without a past, you can't have progress.
Yes, of course. That's what you use the past for, to figure out what you've done wrong and to correct it. But you must still have a goal in mind.
Yeah. Justice. That's what a revolution is. Justice.
I agree. We should have a goal. Thank you.
Elena?
I'm good.
You good? Okay, so Jaros. Yeah. Okay. We'll let Igor first, and then you.
I just have a comment to Ernest's question about success. You know, what indications there of success, if the diaspora had any success in impacting things in Ukraine, I guess is what I understood.
No, in the current countries.
In the current time, okay, yeah.
Let's say Ukrainian diaspora in Germany,
Right.
affecting,
Okay.
let's say, some local politicians saying bad things about Russia.
Right. Okay. I can say both from a Canadian perspective and from an international one, just following the international media. I think the diasporas have had an influence on their medias, on opinion makers, on public intellectuals, that you can see a qualitative shift in the level of understanding and the nuance and analysis of many of these people about issues in Ukraine. When you compare from when Ukraine became independent, Ukraine became, the Orange Revolution was another sort of step forward. And I think the diaspora contributed to this, educating the media, because we're here, we're constantly protesting, doing educative things. And I think that has had an impact. That now you can turn on TV, you have four people speaking about Ukraine, and knowledgeably, not a single one is of Ukrainian background. And I think that the diaspora can take some credit. It's obviously Ukraine takes credit, but the diaspora also takes some credit for that.
Okay. Are there any other questions beyond these two? Anybody else who wants to ask a question? In that case, go ahead, Igor, and then you give it yourself.
My question is going to follow up on what Dr. Sisson was saying about the example of the Russian Orthodox Church in Toronto and how Ukrainians really cannot fit in there now because of the politics involved in the church. And we have various weaponizations from the Kremlin. They weaponize everything. They weaponize religion. they're also weaponizing the diaspora, their own diaspora, trying to have basically develop agents of influence within the countries where Russians have settled. And so can you see any kind of way that the Ukrainian diaspora can somehow work with the Russian diaspora? And I'm not talking about Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but the Russian diaspora, when you have this intense weaponization of that community into virulent anti-Ukrainianism. And if you look at some of the comments that are posted by their trolls, it's like preaching hatred. If they could trace them within Canada, you could basically make a case out for hate propaganda. And so to that I would add the weaponization of multiculturalism. How can Ukrainians in Ukraine, and how can we in the diaspora really treat communities in Ukraine that to some degree are allowing themselves to be weaponized to be pro-Moscow? And I'm not just saying pro-Russian, pro-Moscow, because there has to be a distinction between Moscow and the Russian people. And the development of fifth columns in Ukraine. We see how they are instigating anti-Polish actions within Ukraine, which really Ukrainians weren't doing, and now suddenly as Ukraine is drawn closer to Poland, we see more of that. We also see more anti-Semitic actions in Ukraine, where there weren't that many before, and there's this period of euphoria after the Maidan. And now you're seeing more manifestations of anti-Semitism, and nobody can really trace who's doing it. The Russians, of course, are blaming the various battalions that spout Ukrainian nationalism, etc. But it is most probably the work of the fifth column that is doing to incite Jews against Ukraine, notwithstanding that they're extremely anti-Semitic in the Donbass pseudo republics. So, are you going to work that into your study also? How to deal with this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, yes, in my interviews, I do ask whether there is cooperation or collaboration with the Russian communities. And what actually happens, yes, on collective, on community level, there is no cooperation. But on individual level, there are representatives, I mean, like, they could not be, like, strong, like, really clearly defined as a community. Say, there is old Russian diaspora in Prague. Those people who came there during a long time ago. And they're really supportive towards Ukraine, and they're very critical of the Russian regime, and they make appearances on Ukrainian protests, give support in speeches and so on. So some degree of support, yeah, is there. London has accumulated a lot of Russian opposition. Yeah, now this is Berezovsky and so on. There is very long list of former Russian politicians and activists who fled to London. These people also tried to support Ukrainian community. They were participating in Euromaidan and so on. On the collective level, yes, there is some struggle. I mean, there are some communities. I know in Canada there is association of Russians in Canada, or Russians for Democracy in Canada. This is like explicitly named Russian community, which is clearly pro-Ukraine. So it exists. Unfortunately, it's not in my sum. As for Russians, so I mean, like, it shouldn't be. We shouldn't be relying on this like primordialist imaginings that these people are our enemies and so on. It would be like really big mistake, and this is the case for Ukraine as well. I think it's the question. It's not that much. I mean, culture and language matter. these are very important. But what is more important is like to development of inclusive structures, where people would be proud to belong to this country, to represent this country. And yes, it's challenging, especially as you rightly mentioned, Russia weaponized and exploits, so to say, undefined Russian-speaking community. But I think Ukraine has to work on the inclusion of these people. If you speak about spies and so on, it's the priority of special services. And you mentioned these different provocations. I mean, Ukraine sometimes feels helpless in investigating many criminal cases, including the crimes of Euromaidan. So this actually I don't see this as a rather ethnic or other problem. I see this as a problem of corrupt and quite dysfunctional state. This should be fixed. And then these schemes of solidarity and inclusion should be developed. I mean, like multiculturalism, and yes, there are writings by Taras Kuzyo, for instance, and he argues strongly that Western-style multiculturalism is not possible in Ukraine. I quite disagree with this. I agree that a lot of defenders are using these Western cliches before Euromaidan and before Russian aggression. Those people who are appealing to Western values in order to empower the Russian language, in fact, turn to be like straight away traitors. Yes, this happened. But it shouldn't discourage us to stigmatize or build a ghetto for Russian speakers to try to exclude them somehow. This would be a huge historical mistake for Ukraine. Ukraine has to address these issues, and there is no one way for success. I mean, like every country lives its own, goes its own way, and I hope Ukraine finds effective mechanisms for such inclusion.
Just one of them, the Russian-Canadian Congress largely views itself as a persecuted group kicked around by the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, which is all powerful in the Canadian government. So if you read all of their material,
yes,
they're in total defensive position and worried about Ukrainians everywhere. Yeah.
Very true.
Okay, one last question.
I just have a comment about the spirituality of Ukraine. And that's ties into religion, of course. When a hockey team has the spirit, they usually win the game. When you have 25% of Ukrainians volunteering, that's 25% of the current population of Ukraine are volunteers. They have the spirit. They usually win the game. And without spirituality in a society, you have a dead society. You can't look at your past. You don't know where you are in the present, and you don't know what the future is going to look like. You're dead. So the spirituality aspect of Ukraine, I'm encouraged by it actually, because there are many volunteers. There are not that many volunteers in Canada or anywhere else in the world that I know of. There are 25% of the population of Ukraine are volunteers right now, not taking any money. They're up in the front lines, feeding their soldiers, doing all kinds of things. So the importance of spirituality and the Orthodox Church and all that kind of stuff is very important, I think.
Okay, well, I take this opportunity to thank our speaker. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you.